David Grasso here at the SALT conference in Las Vegas with my new interview here, Lanhee Chen. He's a fellow at the Hoover Institute. How are you doing?
Great, thanks for having me.
So, China, trade, big topics these days. If we look to our left, that's probably what's on the news right now. And it seems like it's something that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, it's not, because we have some systemic challenges we've had with China for a long time. The question is, how do the two largest and most significant economies in the world interact with one another? And really the issue with China has always been, they have a policy, which is an industrial policy designed to boost their own economy. How do we interact and relate to that? And President Trump has really come in to shake things up. And so the relationship, the nature of the relationship is changing.
So yeah, the world economy, the story of the world economy is the so-called chimerica, right? China, America defined all the era before the recession, post-recession, most of recent memory. So even if this trade war is going to be positive in the end, isn't there a lot of pain in the meantime?
Well, there certainly is. I mean, if you think about the application of tariffs, it's clearly hurt the Chinese economy. We've seen a slowdown there. And here in the United States, at some point, we're going to see higher commodity prices. So obviously, there is a price to be paid. There's also the collateral damage of the relationship between the United States and China. And we've got so much cultural and educational and other exchange going on between the two countries. That also gets affected when you have a situation involving conflict or tension between the two sides.
So let's talk about the big elephant in the room, right? Intellectual property. A lot of the back and forth right now is about accountability, making sure China does what it promises at the negotiation table with the U.S. trade authorities.
I mean, I think that's always the million-dollar question,
right?
Which is, how do you hold the Chinese accountable? How do you ensure that they are following up on their promises? And the enforcement mechanism, I think, is really the difficult sticking point in the current negotiation, because I think the Chinese actually understand to a certain degree the value of protecting IP. We've got many more patents coming online from China, much more innovation, so they kind of get it. But the question is, how do you protect it? They've never really had to worry about that before. No. And so for the United States, we've been calling on them to do it for a while. Now the real question is, do we trust the mechanisms that they want to put in place? Do we think they'll be sufficient? I think those are still open questions.
So what's confusing to me is that the US is taking the lead on this, because if you go to the EU, their manufacturing has been greatly dinged by China, as has Japan's, the whole industrialized world. Why is America the loudest voice in the room when trying to hold the Chinese accountable?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the president's approach. Very different, obviously, from how the Europeans would approach it. I don't want to call them conflict averse, but I think that might be a way of describing
Sure.
how the Europeans tend to deal with these situations, because they're concerned about the economic impacts on the EU. And bear in mind, there's a fragility to the EU right now, given what's happening with Brexit. So the dynamic, I think, is very different. The United States ordinarily has been more passive in dealing with the situation. President Trump has a very different approach. We'll see how that works. But the approach, I think, is driven largely by the leadership of America versus what you're seeing in the EU.
And let's talk about the flip side, right? Other countries like Australia and a lot of Latin America has greatly benefited from China's rise. How does that work vis-a-vis America and American interests in those regions?
Well, Australia is an interesting example, because Australia is a linchpin of America's strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And so from a strategic perspective, we want the Australians to be close to us. They certainly are. But you're right, they've benefited a lot from being close to, or arguably within, China's sphere of influence. Australia is sort of the front line, if you will, of a lot of what the Chinese have tried to do with respect to influence activities. You see, for example, Australian educational institutions, Australian cultural institutions. A lot of them have been the target for the Chinese trying to go in and have influence. And so we look to Australia as an example of what we want to try and avoid here in the United States. But there's no question that the economic relationship between the US and Australia doesn't hinge necessarily, but is certainly affected by what's happening with Australia and China.
Let's touch on that point a little bit before you leave me. All these Confucius Institutes on college campuses. I work for an organization that's present on 34 college campuses, and we've known for a long time that the Chinese government is funding these institutes on college campuses, but just now people are, demonstrating their outrage over it. What do you think the future is of that? And, is all this tied together, the trade relationship, the cultural relationship, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, it certainly is all tied together. People's impressions of China, it's all tied together, whether it's the economy, whether it's the cultural issues. I work on a university campus every day, so I see some of the effect of that. And I do have some concerns about the chilling effect potentially on the exchange of ideas between people from different cultures. That having been said, the Confucius Institutes are worthy of oversight, and I think we need some transparency, for example, around where the funding sources are, what the incentives are, so we better understand what these institutes are. Are they really language institutes? Are they really cultural institutes? Or is there something more nefarious going on? That oversight will come from the US Congress, from the administration, and I certainly think it's worthwhile to have some view into what they're doing and where this money is coming from.
Where's the accountability for universities that have allowed these institutes to prosper?
Well, and that's the other part of the problem, is that universities have, in the search for money and for growing their endowments, they have sometimes taken money from unsavory sources, not just necessarily Chinese-aligned sources, but others as well. So we in general need a better accountability regime, just like in campaign finance. We want to know where the money comes from.
Sure.
With universities, I think similar accountability is necessary.
So, back to when we were children, a lot of these arguments hinged on Japan.
Yeah.
And Japan turned out to be its own worst enemy, went into a deflationary spiral, their economy has never recovered. Do you think that's the next chapter for China? Should we not worry so much? Or is Chimerica the future of our economic, future?
Yeah, I don't know that the comparison is exactly apt, primarily because China is such a significantly larger country.
Sure.
And the economy in China is diversified in a way, more diversified, I think, than it was for Japan in the 1980s. But the challenges, China's got tremendous demographic challenges, similarly to what Japan has seen. Japan has seen tremendous demographic challenges. I think what will happen to the US-China relationship does largely hinge on the understanding of both sides that there's some mutual dependence that's going on in terms of the economy of this country, the economy of China, and the better understanding there is around that mutual dependence, the better understanding there is around the fact that I think we do work better when we work together. I don't know that was the case with Japan in the 1980s. Certainly now, though, with the two biggest economies in the world, conflict is probably not the best scenario in the long run. So we'll see what happens. I'm not overly optimistic about it because I do think that there are still some really significant issues with the Chinese economy and how they do business that we in the United States do not find acceptable, and I'm not sure the Chinese are willing to alter. And then there's the question of what the Chinese are trying to do geopolitically and geostrategically, and that creates some conflict as well. So we'll have to see. I'm not overly optimistic, but I'm not a complete pessimist either.